Good afternoon. My name is Charles Jennings. I'm director of the Christian Regenhard Center for Emergency Response Studies here at John Jay College of Criminal Justice. And I'd like to welcome you to this, our final 20th anniversary commemoration of the 9/11 attacks. And this is a really special event we have planned today, not just for the timing, but also in the sense, as you'll find out, how this very neatly draws together a lot of strands that have been brought together over the years. And so it's with a great deal of pleasure that we introduce this session on federal oversight of disasters, looking at the federal role in overseeing the many times local response to disasters and their causes. We have four great panelists with us today. Some of them are new to regular attendees, some are old friends. First, we have Tim Clancy. He's with Arch Street LLC. He's a former staffer for Representative Sherwood Boehlert. Tim has served in senior leadership positions in academia, the private sector, Congress, and the Federal Science Agency. He's represented the National Science Foundation before Congress, and he's also served 2 tours as a staff member on the House Science Committee and as chief of staff to Representative Boehlert, as we discussed. He now leads Arch Street, which is a strategic consulting firm based in Alexandria, Virginia. Glenn Corbett is a professor in the Department of Security, Fire and Emergency Management at John Jay College. He's also on the executive committee of the Christian Regenhard Center and was the kind of founding technical advisor to the Skyscraper Safety Campaign. He's also technical editor of Fire Engineering magazine. We're also pleased to have Robert Joyce. Robert is a staffer for Senator Brian Schatz of Hawaii. Robert is the appropriations director to U.S. Senator Schatz. In this role, he coordinates the senator's work on the Appropriations Committee and serves as his economic policy advisor. Prior to working in the Senate, he worked in FEMA on resilience and preparedness policy, including the agency's lessons learned or later, what became known as a continuous improvement program. And he started off his career in journalism. Our last panelist is Sally Regenhard, and it's kind of ironic and fitting that we kind of took the 20th anniversary of 9/11 to finally pull her into the spotlight in her own right. And so we're very happy to have her here with us today. Sally, first and foremost, is the mother of Christian Michael Otto Regenhard, a probationary 9/11 firefighter who was lost in the collapse of the World Trade Center. Sally first met Glenn and I in her capacity as a mother of a missing firefighter, and it's a story that you'll hear more about. But she went on to found the Skyscraper Safety Campaign, and ultimately working was able to obtain a small congressional earmark to found the Christian Regenhard Center for Emergency Response Studies here at John Jay College. And lastly, I'm Charles Jennings, your moderator. I'm also on the faculty here at John Jay College. I'm director of the Regenhard Center, and worked alongside Sally and Glenn early days post 9/11. So we thought it would be appropriate to begin our session today with a remembrance of Representative Sherwood Boehlert. And in fact, I had reached out to his office up in Utica, or his former office up in Utica, and we were kind of navigating, getting messages back and forth. And at that time, his health was questionable, and regrettably, he passed away on September 20th. And his staffer, one of his former staffers, still works in the 22nd district. Passed on some names of his staffers from the 2002 era, and that's how we got through to Tim Clancy. And so we're delighted to make that connection. Tim, I'm going to go ahead and put your camera on just a quick second so people can see you, and then if you want, we're going to just have a brief series of remembrances of Representative Boehlert.
Thanks, Charles. And thank you so much for having me, and to be able to remember Sherry Boehlert and who he was and what he did, both as chairman of the Science Committee and as a longtime member of Congress who had a tremendous impact in so many different areas. He was environmental, in science and technology, And then also what we now know is the field of Homeland Security and cybersecurity. Really what he did in those fields laid the foundation of what we see today across those domains. So it's really a great honor to be here, and thank you to everyone at the Regenhard Center, and especially Sally, for all they did and all you do, Professor Corbett and Professor Jennings, in getting the National Construction Safety Team Act passed into law. It's a great honor to be here to discuss this. Thank you.
Okay, Sally, would you like to go next?
Okay. Okay, I'm not sure if you can visualize me. I enabled.
We can see you. You look great.
Oh, you can. Okay. Whatever, you know, the baby boomer era person, but it's such an honor to speak about Congressman Boehlert today and to remember him and his fantastic work. And we would not be where we are today. And, you know, I wish we were even further along, but nothing that was achieved could have been done without Congressman Boehlert. I don't think that people realize that in New York City or anywhere else, no one was really looking into why did this happen? And that was my major goal. So to just, God really bless the families. And, you know, through Glenn Corbett and yourself, we contacted his staff, his wonderful staff, and it just progressed from there. But without his interest in science, in technology, and his humanity to say this has to be investigated, no one would have ever known a fraction of the failures of the system of 9/11. So he's someone that I hold in great esteem, and I hope to make it known really what this homegrown son of New York now did for this city and this country.
Thank you, Sally.
Glenn.
Okay. Yeah, it's remarkable to think that, you know, how quickly we will perhaps talk a little bit later about the NCST, National Construction Safety Team Act, how quickly all the pieces came together. And, you know, really, to a great extent, it was a no-brainer. But the essential part was the fact that, you know, that Sally had created the Skyscraper Safety Campaign, was visible, and Chairman Boehlert actually saw her and made that connection, because it happened very quickly. It was obvious what the issues were. And, you know, the fact that Chairman Boehlert had been in Congress for several years, I mean, he knew, he had dealt with FEMA, dealt with NIST, dealt with all the sort of federal agencies and organizations that fell within the jurisdiction of the House Science Committee. But he could see through all that and understood that we needed to have something better. We needed to have, you know, an ability to do a proper inquiry, and not just one aspect of it, but sort of a multidisciplinary look at disasters. And as I was mentioning earlier with some of the attendees, that this is, to me, this is a really wonderful, not only a legacy for Chairman Boehlert, but a real stepping stone for potential future federal legislation that would look more broadly than what we did with the World Trade Center and building disasters. So his legacy lives on. You know, the fact that we all know about the collapse that occurred in Surfside, or at Surfside in Miami several months ago, NIST is there. NIST will develop and prepare the final definitive report on how that apartment building collapsed. And so we all owe that really to Chairman Boehlert. He is the one who saw the need and stepped right in and really moved that legislation through. I mean, it's to think about how we are today and how you know, how partisan perhaps and sort of conflicted we are in government right now. To think back 20 years ago, how everyone sort of did come together and understood that we needed this capability. We needed to understand better about things, because the ultimate goal, of course, was to provide recommendations for improvements to the future. And so that's why Chairman Bullard, again, was at the center of that. And, you know, if it hadn't been him, I don't know who would have been. You know, we really don't know. So we thank him for that. And again, that's a great legacy for his memory. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Glenn. And just to wrap it up, I mean, I did not know Representative Bullard. All I knew of him was what I heard from Sally and Glenn. And from that alone, you know, you could just tell he was a great guy. And of course, he had a good reputation, and an amiable person, a decent person, with really a pretty remarkable record of legislative accomplishment. As you pointed out, Tim, and some of that got covered in his obituary. But one small detail, which I feel compelled, which I think says a lot about him, is that in his official portrait, everybody will notice the baseball there. That's a Yankees baseball. Apparently, he was just an inveterate Yankees fan, and having grown up in upstate New York in Elmira, you know, you saw the Yankees on WPIX on cable. So you grew up, you know, if you were from upstate, you grew up with the Yankees theme, and that was it. So, so I have that in common, and so I just wanted to weigh in on that as we transition now into the formal session. Let me turn off the screen share. Okay, so I just wanted to. Today's session is really, as we talked about originally, was to identify the federal role in oversight of disasters. And even we have an emergency management graduate program at John Jay. And many of our students, when they come in, they have this perception, which is widely held in society, that the federal government is somehow in charge of disasters, and that FEMA can just kind of, you know, jump out of airplanes and show up at a moment's notice anywhere they're needed. And the reality, of course, is that disasters start local. They move up, you know, from the town or city to the county to the state, and then go federal. And so it is not a foregone conclusion that the federal government would really have a role in overseeing disasters and disaster response above and beyond what's in FEMA. And so I think this is an important topic, because as our society continues to become more disaster prone and vulnerable, you know, FEMA is getting more and more active, and we have more events of interest, and really some of these lessons learned kind of must be documented, and the capacity to do that often lies at a higher level of government than the municipality where the emergency may happen to occur. The other issue with that, of course, is that the federal government, being federal, they're above the kind of fray of local politics, which you know, not unexpectedly rears its head in looking critically at many disasters. And so it's not just an issue of local capacity, but also an issue of local will. And so, and I don't want to set this up as a local versus federal issue, but there's certainly a dynamic there, and certainly the federal role, I think, is critical. So we're going to start today by talking about the kind of starting, you know, I guess on September, you know, 11th, after the towers had come down, and kind of quickly trace the history and the origins of the National Construction Safety Team. And we're going to have the opportunity to hear first from Sally, then Glenn, and then Tim, as, you know, someone directly affected, someone assisting with advocacy, and then the person working on the legislative side. So Sally, if you want to start in on the on that story.
Yes, thank you. My reaction to 9/11 was that, first of all, at that time I was living in a high-rise building on the I moved a few times in that building, but I was on the 30th floor of that building, 32nd rather, I'm sorry, and where I had lived for many, many years. And, you know, when I heard this happened on the morning news, I ran to my son's room, which had the great view of the skyline of New York City. And believe it or not, you know, I could see the entire skyline from Lower Manhattan north. And I took a pair of binoculars and I was just looking at this because I was in such a state of shock, and I actually saw both buildings collapse. At that time, I didn't know that my son was there, although I had a terrible feeling. My first reaction, of course, I was in shock. I couldn't be in grief because I didn't know at that point, but as days went by and time went by, I became so angry. But watching that, even from the great distance, you know, with binoculars, I could not believe that the tallest buildings then were the tallest buildings in the world at that time, designed to hold the largest number of people, could collapse in front of my eyes, just like something in the third world country, like towers of salt, pillars of salt. I just could not believe it. I immediately started writing letters to different members of Congress. Oh, well, all the elected officials in New York City, by the way, and other members of Congress whom I felt, you know, should be responding to this. I was so outraged about it. Unfortunately, no one answered me back. I couldn't get anywhere with what I was doing on my own. And then really by the grace of God, in December, the following December, there was an article in the Daily News which said 2 professors seek further investigation. I couldn't believe it. I said, you mean there's another person in New York City who feels that it requires further investigation? Anyway, I contacted them. It was not easy to get through. You know how the system is, but I was finally able to get them. They finally received the message, you know, from the switchboard, whatever, at John Jay. And then that began this collaboration and my education. And I really have to say, you know, Glenn Corbett is someone that you'll see in many photos with us. He was always with us, and he was speaking to many family members and advising us. But the collaboration of Charles and Glenn, who collaborated on everything, and they probably still do, I'm sure, that was what made a difference. And just very slowly, I began to be educated. I was just a typical person, a normal, you know, a resident of New York who didn't know anything about the failures of 9/11. I thought, I bought the line that, you know, was starting to be circulated and that I didn't know. As time went by, I found out about the building design, the construction, the immunities of the Port Authority. I found out that these buildings were exempt and immune from all New York City building and fire codes. I found out about the total failure and coordination of emergency management in those days. I found out about the radios. I found out that the same radios that they were carrying failed in 1993. I found out so much, and I have to say that both of these professors are fabulous educators, and I'm a good student. Having attended Catholic school, for 12 years and 2 years of Catholic graduate school, you have to be a good student. And so they were able to enable me. And I want to thank them for their kindness and, you know, people who spoke about me. But I was just the face of the 9/11 mothers and the face of the 9/11 families. I would have gotten nowhere without the good fortune of meeting Glenn Corbett and Charles Jennings and John Jay College. And that's how it started. And we started our advocacy. I found out about all the failures, and Charles and Glenn were able to get this wonderful board of advisors for the skyscraper safety campaign, in emergency management, fire, building evacuation, construction, structural engineers, all these different people from all over the United States, and some were even from Europe, who were passionately interested in this subject. That's really how it started. I still had no support from anyone in New York City. And one day I just happened to be in the building where former Senator at that time, Hillary Clinton, had her offices. I was attending another meeting for victims or something in a totally different area. And when I walked in, all the press were there. And Hillary was there talking. So I moved myself in, I positioned myself. People were, raising their hands and asking questions. And with the information that I learned from Glenn and Charles, I put my hand up and I said I was representing my local newspaper, which in a sense I was, because I used to work pro bono for that paper, write community articles. I put up my hand and I said, Senator Clinton, will you support a federal investigation into the collapse of the World Trade Center? Well, you couldn't say no, because of course I had a picture of my son and I identified myself as a firefighter mother. But, to her credit, and I must give her the credit, she said yes, without hesitating, and so on and so forth. Of course, the Daily News wrote it up in a negative way, and the headline was "Firefighter Mom Ambushes Hill," which for Hillary. I got them to change, the title of that, because that was unfair. But that's how it started, and it was a long, long road to achieving that. But again, Glenn Corbett found out about Congressman Bullard, and with all of the advocacy that we did at Ground Zero, our press conferences, my role was to raise the awareness of the public, because the average member of the public had no idea, just as I didn't. So that was my goal. I was constantly down there with the families of the victims, and we spread the news. And by the grace of God, we were able to have all the families come down. They were very outraged, as we were. And as they found out more and more, they signed onto our petitions. We had petitions, and we just did so much. But by the grace of God, Congressman Bullard must have heard about this or seen this maybe. And he was really the savior of science and of investigation during this time. So without him, this never would have happened. And the big lie, everything was great, wasn't it wonderful? Rah, 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 wave the flag. We found out that 9/11, the collapse of the World Trade Center, rather specifically, is something that never should have happened in the amount of seconds or minutes that it happened. And that was something that was very hard to achieve. But as time went by, then should I speak about actually the hearings that we had? I'm not sure how long I should speak before the hook comes out.
No. Why don't we? We'll go kind of pre-hearings, and then we'll come back to you when we get down to DC for the hearing. How's that?
Right. Absolutely.
Okay.
Absolutely.
Glenn, do you want to step in?
Sure. Thanks, Sally. She really set the stage for us here. Was that newspaper article in the Daily News that connected Charles and I to Sally. And, at the end of the day, probably the most critical situation here was that Charles and I are technical people, sort of content people. Sally is has the moral authority side of the equation. So we worked great as a team together. She was able to open doors, and then we could go and address the specific issues. You know, she pointed out, you know, the World Trade Center, as well as a lot of other high-rise buildings, have issues. We've had it for a long time. There's you know, a lot of people don't understand that our building codes, you know, are developed privately by nonprofits, but they effectively are set at the bare minimum that everyone majority can sort of accept as what we should have. So the building codes are in fact the minimum, and we know that Charles and I have known for decades that there are other things going on. 9/11 was a lightning rod for these things: stairwell width, fire resistance of the structural frame of the building, the skeleton of the building, things along those lines that we've been very concerned about for a long time. And then so 9/11 happens, and all of those are front and center. And so, you know, from our perspective, you know, this, again, it was the most important thing, was that Sally had the ability to open doors for us that we could go and talk to people. And of course, as she mentioned, she's an excellent student. So as time went on, she was able to understand a lot of the specifics, and she was able to actually develop sort of a set of goals for skyscraper safety, things that we wanted to accomplish. We did all of them. We got the federal investigation and a few others. One we never got, actually, was the one she mentioned earlier. The Port Authority of New York and New Jersey is still exempt from local regulations. You know, and I could say honestly, despite the fact that they claim otherwise, that we do know that, you know, they take advantage of minimum code requirements and things. So, so again, the lead up to meeting with the staff, Tim and other folks, and Professor and Chairman Bollert's office, all that led up was sort of getting public attention on that issue. Because if you remember, of course, everyone who was on this call remembers what was going on. I mean, we were focused on the buildings and the emergency response and things in New York City, but of course, there was a lot more going on with respect to you know, the attacks themselves. How did it happen? How did we miss signs? The CIA, FBI issues, all those things are going on at the same time as well. So Sally didn't mention, but Sally also was, you know, at the time, again, I'm talking like tail end of 2001, beginning of 2002. There's a lot of things in motion. Sally, I think you'll see later on some photos perhaps of her in front of the White House, because she was also involved with trying to get a, you know, a more broad inquiry into 9/11. How did we get attacked this way? Which of course eventually led to the 9/11 Commission. So, you know, and I think I should also point out that you know, in my own career, it's abundantly clear. I mean, it's clear as a bell to me that the kind of things that I do, I'm involved still with things that revolve around 9/11 and other kind of building issues and stuff. It is really critical that you have, or we have, a sort of a, we'll call them civilian, whatever you want to call them, a non-technical person that has that moral authority. That was absolutely essential to all this, to this happening. So again, leading up to the hearings and things, we were trying to get the word out. Sally was down here constantly to Washington and here in New York, trying to get attention to not even just the skyscraper safety issues, but other ones as well. And, you know, at the end of the day, it really did boil down to compared to the nearly 3,000 people killed on 9/11, it really boiled down to, and from my perspective, a few dozen people that were the most active back then, and to this day is whittled down to just really a handful of active people that still sort of continue for the advocacy work. So again, I think from, you know, the lead up to the hearings was an important time. One last point, we did actually have the very first press conference for skyscraper safety was in late December. It was around Christmas. It was incredibly nasty weather, and it was outdoors in front of City Hall. And it may have been that article that the New York Times wrote. Jim Glantz, who's done a lot of 9/11 work with us, wrote a book. We still work with him to this day. Jim actually was interviewing Sally, and because the weather was so darn bad, it was rainy, just foggy. It was just a really bad day, and to do a press conference. I can remember Jim Glantz actually getting in the back of the car with Sally to do the interview because they actually get them out of the weather so they could focus on it. And that article, again, for us was really critical because we were very concerned about what was going on with the physical evidence. You know, FEMA, and maybe Tim might want to talk about this a little bit. And actually, Bob might as well have worked for FEMA. FEMA at the time had a very noticeable program, and that's not the right word, but a program to do building disaster investigations. So, for example, they did the Murrah building collapse after the domestic terrorist attack that occurred back in the 90s. And they had a series of these they did over the years, but we saw this. The problem was they were very narrowly focused. And that was really the big issue for us. They're very narrowly focused. And we felt that if you have a disaster, of course, it's not just one specific thing that's a problem. It's usually a chain link of all sorts of different issues. And so that's why we were sort of pushing against FEMA's work. We were pushing for physical evidence acquisition. You know, I went with some other people associated with Sally and I out to the place in Jersey City. I'm a Jersey guy, so we met in the Hugo Schnitzer yards in Jersey City, where most of the steel from the World Trade Center was going first before it left the country. It was being basically cut down in smaller pieces. And we found out that FEMA really did not have the bottom line with their FEMA investigation was they did not have the legal authority to sort of take action and get physical evidence. They didn't have enough time. They had wonderful people involved, but they had no money. I mean, compared to what was eventually needed for NIST and things. So it was some turmoil going on back then. You know, we were pushing back against, again, the FEMA BPAT team, Building Performance Assessment team. We were pushing back against that because we were telling them, look, if you want to know how these buildings came down, you at least got to get the critical pieces of steel, and nobody was following that. No one was actually looking for that. And the net result is that NIST, despite all the wonderful work they did, you know, from a structural collapse standpoint, they really had relatively small amount of physical evidence, particularly the columns that were in the center of both towers. Those were essential to understand what was going on. And if I recall correctly, I think we ended up with either one or two from both buildings. There were 56 in both. So we missed all that physical evidence. Does it take away from the results of the report? No, it doesn't. But back then, you know, we didn't want to rely on computer modeling completely. We wanted computer modeling to verify the physical evidence that was collected. And so that was, again, at the heart of the issue. So that's the lead up from what I remember. And Charles, take it from there.
Okay. Yeah. And just the FEMA effort, just to clarify that, was the Building Performance Assessment team was being assisted by the Structural Engineers Association of New York, but that was being done on a largely pro bono basis. And so it was essentially just under-resourced, and as Glenn pointed out, kind of under authorityed, if you will, legally, to kind of go in and do what we felt needed to be done. Another thing which just occurred to me is, as I was listening to everybody talking, was the fact that we had this conference that had been pre-planned in January of 2002 at the college, looking at, it was called the Urban Hazards Forum, and that was actually done under FEMA Region 2 sponsorship. And as part of that conference, we were going to have a panel looking at the 1993 World Trade Center bombing and response to talk about lessons learned. And so that event ended up, we ended up getting a Deputy Chief, Charles Blake from FDNY, who came in and was the first kind of the crack in the armor for the kind of the narrative that everything was fine with the response. And he was candid about the fact, and not overly, but he was candid about the fact that there was some loss of accountability of personnel at the event, which was apparent to everybody who was kind of watching from a distance. But he confirmed that, and that got widespread press attention in January of 2002. And Charles subsequently ended up retiring from FDNY. And he was also a former Marine, which I think was a bond with another bond he had with Christian. And so, I think that helped set the stage also, Glenn, for looking more systematically, not just at the structure, but at the building itself. So as we shift the focus now from New York to DC, Tim, do you want to step in and kind of pick it up from your perspective?
Sure. Thanks, Charles. So a couple of points that follow up on things that Sally said, as well as Glenn. I think we have to remember the time that we were in when that legislation was ultimately, first created and passed. And, as Glenn said, Sally's moral authority and the moral authority of all the families was strongly recognized by Mr. Bullard. Of course, it was also by other members, as Sally's anecdote about Mrs. Clinton. How are you going to say no to the bereaved widow of a firefighter? You can't do that. Though they can, play a Washington game of delay until things go on. But one of the things that I'm really proud of at the time is we didn't do that. And it just happened to be, and I do think this is a bit of a happy accident, that, Sherry Bullard was the chairman. He was from New York. He was a chairman of a committee that had the ability, it was in his power to craft the legislation. And I think another important point to make is he had important, good relations with the Senate. We can't forget that. This wasn't all just one guy. Obviously, at that time, and this is an important aspect of this, is that he really had good relations with his Senate counterparts to the point where the Senate essentially took the House version. This is my recollection at the time. They didn't even have a standalone version. Maybe someone can refresh my recollection. They simply passed the House version of the bill. I don't think there were hardly any changes. It was a situation where we were able to negotiate almost simultaneously with the Senate over the fall before the passage of the final bill. And then, as well as the administration, we can talk specifically. I think Glenn mentioned the subpoena power issue and some additional words that were put in clarifying this non-regulatory role. And I think that this probably then leads into discussion of the next generation of disaster response investigations. Is that one of the things that I recall at that time was that, yes, the National Construction Safety Teams Act, as we ultimately came out with, relatively limited in the sense that it was limited to NIST, a non-regulatory agency, and had certain guardrails that prevent the findings from being evidenced into litigation or other types of disputes. However, what it's really designed to do, as Glenn alluded to, is to inform the next generation of building standards and codes, wherever they may be, and really to advance, structural engineering and emergency preparedness for all structures. So Sherry had, as I was talking earlier to a number of the folks when we were gathering before everyone got together, he had been a member of Congress for over 20 years, but he'd also been a staff member for 20 years prior to that. So his involvement in the House of Representatives goes back to the 1960s. And in this case, oftentimes, a staff member negotiate and work on legislation and then present it to the members who make decisions ultimately. But in this case, Sherry Bullard personally would call Sally and call Glenn and do things actively, I don't say on his own, because he was his boss, he could do whatever he wants to do, but in many ways unique to even any of the other bills that we ever did that were passed into law, is he actively acted as his own staff member, which is generally not a good idea, but that's a whole other topic of discussion. But that again was a bit of a happy accident in the sense that he was a person who saw what needed to be done and had the tools at his disposal to be able to make things happen. And I think being a Republican actually was a tremendous advantage in the sense, of course, he was the majority at the time, Republicans were in the majority at the time, but because he was from the moderate wing of the party, had the relationships amongst many different factions to be able to negotiate. So what looked like a very seamless, easy thing to do within, a few months, of course, takes a lot of work. And again, I think that a lot of the credit has to go to Sally for her emotional appeal that breaks through a lot of the, bureaucratic and the factional log jams. And that we often talk about data-driven decisions and policymaking, but let's face it, there's an emotional context to any type of policymaking. And without that, who's going to say no to a nun? Who's going to say no to a nun? You're not. So we can talk about structural engineering, but you're not going to say no to that. And that was the difference.
Thanks, Tim.
It really was.
So, Sally, you want to talk about going down to the Washington for that hearing in March of 2002?
She's on
I'm
mute.
sorry. Here I am. So Tim had mentioned this wonderful picture of the nun, and it was somewhat obliterated. It might still be, but look, my role was to organize people, to organize the family members, and to really educate them the way that I had the good fortune to be educated by Glenn and yourself. And so we, when Glenn told us about this committee hearing and that this was going to happen, I organized as many families as I could, and we got on the train. We took it down there with the family members. And I asked this nun, Sister Michael Mary Campbell, I asked her to, would she like to join us? I wanted her with me because she had been a great source of consolation after 9/11. And when I had the memorial service from my son at St. Patrick's Cathedral, and I have to reiterate that it was a memorial service. My son is one of the 40% of all the firefighters and all the uniformed services that perished on 9/11, who had never had any identification whatsoever. To this day, there are 1,100 people, 40% of those are the uniformed services, who have never been identified. So she was a great source of consolation then at his beautiful service, memorial service at St. Patrick's. I asked her, would she go? And she was so enthusiastic about everything that we were doing. And she came with us. And I really feel that this picture, and especially being in the Times, it was nearly a third of a page in the Times, which was shocking. This really set the standard. This let not only people in New York, but people probably all over the world, there's international, editions of the Times, let them know what was going on. Jim Glantz, a great reporter, writing about this issue, and that really started it. And I have to say that, when we first came in, there was a lot of experts and, of course, people representing different fields, and sort of builders and developers, and all of these people were there, and they were going to testify. And when we first came into the room, it was my first time inside that building. It was my first time taking part in an actual, congressional hearing. And the first row was all, there were these signs on it, reserve, reserve, reserve. So, being a New Yorker, I brought my people up, and there was a lot of family members, and I sat everybody, and I sat myself with the nun and the pictures and the other family members in the first row. One of these, I call them certain people I called stuffed suits and fat cats, came over to me and said, oh no, you can't sit there. You know, these are for the experts and the important people. I turned to him and I said, you know what? The most important people in this room today are the families of the victims. We're sitting here. So I don't know where I got this from. I was a totally different person before 9/11, but we sat there. This picture was taken, and that's what launched it. And I have to say that, again, my goal was to inform the public of what was going on. No one knew anything, and that was the purpose of it. And really, it was in honor of all the uniformed services, the 343 firefighters, the families of all of these victims, as well as honoring the families and the memory of the deceased civilians. And we had both civilian people in our group, as well as families of the uniformed victims. So this is what launched it. You have to get the attention of the public. I always felt the public is like a sleeping giant. And, you know, and I'm really, you know, totally in agreement with Tim and all of his comments. The public is like a sleeping giant, and the system is so afraid of public outcry and public participation in these issues. But that's what happened. That was my goal. The public has power, and what they need to do is speak up. If you can't come down and have, you know, gatherings, and you can't attend rallies, and they could always write letters to the newspaper. That's what they did. During our advocacy and reaching out, you know, as Glenn mentioned, we were also allowed to picket the White House, which is shocking, but in those days there was such great reverence for all the families of the victims. And we were calling on the president at that time to look into further, investigate this with the 9/11 Commission, to convince him to go further and investigate all the aspects of it, and so on and so forth. So that was something that we were proud of doing. And, you know, I'm there in this picture with two civilian family members. My co-chair of the Skyscraper Safety, Monica Gabriel, we were together all the time. And she brought the civilian aspect to this. You can't just be advocating for one group like the uniformed services. Everyone died that day. You know, nearly 3,000 people. Everyone's life was equal, and it was very helpful. So we continued. That started the steamroller system, and then from then on, the elected officials and certain people were really listening to what we had to say. And of course, to Chairman Bohlert's great credit, he was aware long before this picture, long before this hearing. And again, he should rest in peace. He's my hero among the other heroes from John Jay College, which really is Glenn Corbett and Charles Jennings and what they have done for this city and really for the country and the world. They've shown a light on what happened and how all of these issues can be improved.
Okay, thank you, Sally. Glenn, do you have anything you want to add on the DC side of the equation?
Sure, just a couple things. Charles, you want to put that picture back up just for a second? If you can. So as Sally mentioned earlier, it was really organizing lots of people. And Sally did exactly that. She brought people to the hearings. There were two of them, one on March 6th, the other on May 1st, to sort of sort out what was needed and all the hard work that Tim and his colleagues did. But I just want in that photo, I just want to point out one other individual there. On the left is Beverly Eckert. Beverly lost her husband on 9/11. Beverly was with us for quite a while. She actually created the group called Voices of September 11th, Voice of 9/11. She was a great assistance to us. Again, another leading family member. And unfortunately, some of you probably know that she lost her life in a plane crash on our way to a high school reunion in Buffalo, New York, during an ice storm. And ironically, coming out of her death, her sisters actually initiated a project to sort of get congressional hearings into how is it that we've pushed safety aside, particularly in the issues of aviation for these, I don't know what you call them, contract airlines for the big airlines, basically, because again, it was a result of training issues, a result of lack of sleep, pay scales, all sorts of things. But you know, again, her sisters have carried on her legacy, ironically, with that. So just I guess a couple points to make about the hearings. As I recall, they were long, very exhaustive, you know, to some extent, very probing, or they were very probing, but to some extent also perhaps damning to some of the existing policies that were in place to deal with building disasters. I mean, our whole point was that you have the two biggest buildings in recorded human history to ever collapse, and we throw a FEMA team with $1 million and very little time and no authority to do a lot of things. So to us, it was a no-brainer. It was something that we need to have a better capability of doing that. And again, I want to thank you know, Tim and his colleagues, but also Robert, who's working on another bill we'll talk about here in a little bit, because it's the staff people that really sort out a lot of the details. And I remember back then talking about it can't, you know, this can't be just about the structural failure. Enormously important, incredibly important, but it needs to look at all the other aspects, most notably issues of evacuation, particularly for high-rise buildings or other kinds of buildings. For example, NIST actually did an NCST investigation of the Rhode Island nightclub fire, which killed 100 people. And that became really important to changing some of the regulations for nightclubs a few years later, but also looked at the issue of emergency response. And so NIST, you know, in one of their subsequent investigations, looked at Joplin, Missouri, and the tornadoes that went through there several years ago. And all those three pieces, how is it that a hospital in Joplin, Missouri loses every window, yet the building doesn't collapse, but it becomes completely non-functional? We need to do a better job about critical buildings in our country. And that's one thing that the building codes do not deal with. They don't take a hospital in terms of its importance in during a disaster. They don't take that into account. All they deal with is the emergency within the building, not from outside. So things like that. So it was really, really important that we broadened out not just the collapse, but the other things. Because FEMA was always about the collapse, and we were able to get those other things as part of the act. One other point, again, it comes to mind here, you know, to show you how things move. In September of 2002, Congress actually left Washington and came to New York for to sit in you know, in place there in New York instead of Washington in honor of what happened on 9/11. And it was that September 11th weekend that Sally and Monica, who Sally mentioned earlier, actually went out to Staten Island, where then Senator McCain was having a meeting or some kind of event. And so the two of them went out there and they basically told him, hey, Senator McCain, this bill for the National Construction Safety Team Act is in your committee. He was a chairman of the Senate Science Committee. And that was like a Saturday. By Tuesday, it was voted out completely out of the committee. So it moved very quickly. So as Tim mentioned earlier, it moved very swiftly through the House, introduced, I think, in mid-July, early July. And it was pretty much finished at that point. It was over in the Senate. And so maybe that was another critical meeting here. So because of the first week of October, President Bush signed the act into law, and that's where we are today. And so that's sort of my takeaway on this. It was, again, I think to a great extent, it was a no-brainer. We had the moral authority with Sally and her colleagues and the families and stuff to help us get through. We had the technical expertise of our own group to sort of inform, the legislation and try to get it set up correctly. And so that set us in motion. And so that's kind of where we are right now. And I think, Charles and I deal with emergency management, both from an academic standpoint and practical standpoint. And we realized that, that the NCST was a wonderful piece of legislation, but of course it's focused just on building disasters, just like the NTSB is focused on plane and train and pipeline disasters, chemical board for explosions. So those are all very critical pieces of the capability of having the federal government do this, because as Charles mentioned earlier, we need to have a federal look at this stuff. And that's really critical, because this is well beyond the capability and really the local politics of what happens. These are, even though disasters are local, their implications are national. So Charles, is that a good handoff? That was
a tremendous handoff. Tim, did you have anything you wanted to interject before we transition over?
Yeah, I'll just quickly say I had not heard that story about Sally and McCain. That's an interesting anecdote. I will also say, though, my recollection of the time was because Sherry had a strong personal relationship with McCain, that there was a strong degree of trust that isn't normally there between the House and the Senate, that allowed us to quickly negotiate, things that generally is not the case, but in those days there was.
Okay, and we'll have time to come back to that. Just for everybody, the audience, we're going to turn over to Robert Joyce now from Senator Schatz's office to talk about the National Disaster Safety Board legislation that's out there. And I think just very clearly, I think one of the analogies that we drew at the time of 9/11 was that if this were a plane wreck, we'd be putting the pieces back together in a hangar somewhere. And yet we have a building structural collapse and the stuff's going on to barges to get cut up. Anyway, so Robert, I know you've got a hard stop at 3, so I'm going to shut up and let you do your thing. Let us, the audience, know about this great piece of legislation.
Thank you, Charles. I really appreciate the opportunity to talk about this, and really appreciate hearing from the other panelists as well. I've learned a lot just hearing about the story of this particular piece of legislation creating the construction safety team. So thank you all for that. So I'm going to talk about the Disaster Learning and Life Savings Act of 2021, which Senator Schatz introduced this Congress and last Congress. I'm going to get into the origins of the idea, kind of where we came up with it, how long has it been around, talk through the legislation itself, and then provide a little bit of a status update on where we're at now and any challenges and opportunities going forward. So as the folks on the panel know, this idea has been around for quite a while. Glenn has talked about this and written about this in different forms, Charles as well, I believe. Dr. Bill Hook has talked about this for a good amount of time, Dr. Tom Kirsch, Dr. Lori Peak, and many others that we've talked to have been calling for different iterations of this kind of idea for a long time. The bill creates essentially the National Transportation Safety Board, or a body akin to it, for disasters. And I'll get into kind of what that means, but we're looking at the need here as right now when it's a natural hazard, think a hurricane or certainly in Hawaii, a volcanic eruption, and and elsewhere in the country, wildfires, flash floods, heat waves, even right now, to look at the why, it different from the why did this event happen is why did people die in this event, and why was the economic impact such? And to answer that question right now, policymakers rely on a kind of patchwork of studies. FEMA's got an after action program that I used to work in and has been alluded to a couple times in this talk already. There's other agencies in the government that do their own kind of audits. The inspectors general have have a role. GAO, Government Accountability Office, has a role. Of course, the media has a role. And all of them kind of look at their own thing. The FEMA reports look at FEMA's role and responsibilities as defined by the Stafford Act, fairly narrowly as defined by the Stafford Act. GAO looks at the federal response and so on. Occasionally, there's a look at state and local actions, but not often. And really, no one has the mandate to look at a cross-cutting review of how do all levels of government and the private sector interact. Why are some areas as vulnerable as they are, et cetera. So there's a patchwork of different organizations. Just to kind of highlight this past week, the U.S. Commission on Civil Rights announced a review of the 2017 hurricane season and kind of disparate impacts on folks and on some vulnerable populations. This is 4 years now after the fact, and it's an organization that, frankly, it's not clear that this organization would have come up with the idea for a review, and it's great that it's happening. But it just gives you an idea of kind of how scattershot this process currently is. And it being scattershot, what that takes away from policymakers and what that takes away from local officials too is the ability to do any kind of trend analysis and look at, are we winning or losing over time? Are we getting better at these certain things, or are we not? And it's difficult to see that, and it's difficult to see kind of the impact on mitigation spending, resilience spending, all of this in terms of protecting life. There's certain studies that look at the kind of return on investment of these investments, but not a lot of solid evidence to say we can protect human lives by investing in these ways. So to talk about this a little bit more, I'll mention the National Transportation Safety Board and why the Senator Schatz's legislation uses the NTSB as a model. So the NTSB is, as most of you know, looks into plane crashes, major railroad accidents, commercial highway accidents, et cetera. The organization is tasked with revealing the course of events that led up to the accident. So I think Glenn mentioned, the tragic plane crash in upstate New York earlier. And, things like crew rest and things like that are contributing factors to the actual crash. That's the kind of what the NTSB looks at, and they're very good at it, honestly. So it's an independent body. It doesn't fall under DOT. It doesn't fall under that kind of leadership. Its reports are public. Its reviews and recommendations are trusted on a bipartisan basis. They can make recommendations to all levels of government. It doesn't just need to be recommendations aimed at DOT or FAA or et cetera. And it's important to know that there are other safety bodies and regulatory bodies in the transportation space. There's the FAA, there's the Highway Traffic Safety Agency, right? There's other groups here, but it's understood to be important to have an independent organization come in and do a review after major crashes to determine why they happened and to make recommendations up and down levels of government into the private sector. Importantly, also, the NTSB is able to advocate for its own recommendations. They're allowed to communicate them. They do wrap-up reports, and they're able to kind of push them and communicate with Congress and really convey what those recommendations are. So, we can kind of see why the NTSB is a reasonable standard to look at when we're looking at, okay, how should we be learning from natural hazards in this different sphere? So, and that's what the Disaster Learning Life-Saving Act does. It creates an analog body in the natural hazards sphere. So I'll talk a little bit about what we have in mind for a National Disaster Safety Board. So similar to the NTSB, you appoint 7 members to this board. These 7 members are drawn from, both political parties and from various levels of government and various types of expertise, from academia to state, local, federal practitioners. These are, emergency managers or resilience experts, folks in mitigation, engineers, et cetera. So you appoint 7 leaders who are experts in the field to it, and you give them a staff, and you hire up, permanent specialists to perform these reviews. To give folks an idea, the NTSB has about 400 staff members that do their work. So included in Senator Schatz's legislation too is what we're calling the Office for the Protection of Disproportionately Impacted Communities. So what this does is it's a kind of check within the board to say, hey, we're reviewing why these natural hazards resulted in the loss of life and why they resulted in such negative economic impacts. But while we're doing so, we need to keep in mind that some populations are more vulnerable than others and tend to take the brunt of these incidents. And we should target the review to determine why that is and how to better protect these communities. So it's a kind of internal check within this oversight and review body, analytical body. So, and we're hoping that also sends a signal that review and this openness and this oversight is a good thing, and that even the board itself internally in its organization is open to it and subject to it. So that's the kind of setup of the board, and we've heard about the NTSB and the kind of similar analog structure that we're bringing into the National Disaster Safety Board. So I'm going to talk a little bit about how we think these reviews will go down, and then move it on from there. So the board's task here, and this is important, is to determine why people die in these incidents, why people die as a result of natural hazards. Why, in the Pacific Northwest this past year, there was a heat wave and people died. People died in their homes, people died elsewhere. And, just to name another couple of incidents, flash floods as a result of a hurricane this past year killed people in New York City. Why do these things happen? Why were these people in a position where they were vulnerable? Similarly, why do folks sustain injuries as a result of these natural hazards? And then as a much lower priority to the loss of life and injury, why did economic damage take place? Just, destruction of property, et cetera. Too often the focus is on this kind of property damage, and this board is set up to reverse that, to really prioritize the human life aspect of this and to really get into that. So when do you start a review? So we think this is really important. We think kind of the agenda setting for a research body like this is important. So a review is triggered when 10 people or more die as a result of a natural hazard. I know 10 sounds like just like a nice round number that a Hill staffer like myself just pulled out, but looking at the amount of reviews that we think is, this at some point is a capacity question, and at some point is how many of these do we think are warranted before we get to saturation and we're just finding the same underlying causes again and again and again. And if you look at how many hazards kill 10 or more people, you get something in the 20 to 40 range on average over the past couple of decades. And I can talk a little bit more about that if folks are interested. Another trigger is if a state or local government asks the board for a review. So the governor writes a letter and asks the board for a review. A mayor writes a letter and asks the board for a review. A review could also be triggered when the Office for Disproportionately Impacted Populations, which I talked about earlier, asks for one within the board and recommends it to the board and to the board's chairperson. And then finally, the board can then choose to look at kind of any other type of hazard by a majority vote. And we think this is important because we don't want to get hung up on the metrics here. There are some near miss incidents that can provide some really valuable information. We want the board to be led by experts with agency to go after the information where it exists. Folks might remember a near miss of a dam collapse in California, Orville, the Orville Dam kind of complex, and that was quite nearly a tragedy, if not for quick response efforts and in the end successful response efforts to kind of mitigate any potential collapse there. That could still be warranted a review, right? Thankfully nothing bad happened there, but it could have, right? And we might want to look into how that went down. So that's kind of what triggers a review. And now once a review gets started, it's important to dwell on, these are not kind of adversarial investigations. I don't want folks to think of like the FBI showing up and like asking really difficult questions and the Fed showing up and kind of pulling people into rooms and interrogations and all this stuff. It's not like that. The NTSB uses the party system, which means that folks that were kind of part of this accident can take part. So in the disaster world, we might imagine state and local governments having representatives on the review team. We might imagine, a relevant private sector entity having a say in the review. That's not to say that they are directing it or able to influence what kinds of questions get asked, but they're a part of it, right? And they get to contribute their expertise to finding answers here. So it's not adversarial. It's meant to be a collaborative environment and a collaborative exercise to get to answers to help prevent the loss of life in the future. And then I also, while this review is taking place, there's a number of other bodies that are out there that perform similar work on occasion, but not quite the same mandate. And we want to make sure that there's not a duplication of efforts here and that folks are not kind of in the way. Unlike a plane crash or a train accident that the NTSB works with, natural hazards are often an ongoing extended response and certainly recovery effort. And we don't want the board to be in the way of any first responders, obviously, or any officials with life-saving responsibilities. Similarly, we don't want the board to be, we don't want the board and NIST, for example, NIST's investigation into Joplin was, yeah. So I saw Tim's question there. The answer is yes. We've pulled that over from NIST's legislation. Actually, we've pulled that.
Or if you could just repeat the question, just so for the people that don't have the chat going.
Oh yeah. Tim asked, will the board's findings be barred from being used in litigation like NIST or NCST findings? And my best recollection from the legislation is that the answer is yes, and that we actually pulled that aspect in from the NCST legislation. But on this, collaboration point, we've given the board the kind of proactive burden and the proactive responsibility to go out there and identify who else is in this space that could be doing a review on any natural hazard of this kind, and to proactively go out there and coordinate with them. So we don't want, and we want them to have a kind of standing agreement, an MOU or what have you with NIST, for example, or with FEMA's after action team and with the IGs and et cetera, right? We want them to have a standing plan for how they'll go about these reviews so that, after the fact, when they're trying to do the review, it doesn't get messy. And then we've, really clearly specified that they've got to get out of the way of, of local responders and of anybody involved in the response and recovery efforts. So that's we want that to be very clear too. So the vision of the legislation is that this review takes place and that recommendations are made to all levels of government, to relevant private sector entities. And, in addition to the recommendations, kind of root causes identified for, whether it's maybe so many folks shouldn't be living in a floodplain that is so vulnerable, or, maybe we need to look at building codes or so on and so forth, right? And then to make the recommendations accordingly. The federal entities that receive recommendations are on the hook to respond to those recommendations, but there's no kind of forcing mechanism for anybody else to respond to them. So that's the idea. That's the kind of board and what we see as its responsibilities and how it would work. There's a long list of supporters for this idea. It's been around for a little bit, as I mentioned, but right now for this particular piece of legislation, we've got former FEMA administrators from the Trump and Obama administration, got the former head of the Army Corps of Engineers on board. Army Corps obviously has a critical role in some of the resilience and recovery pieces of natural hazards and disasters. Retired General Russell Honore, who folks might remember as taking over post-Hurricane Katrina operations, is a supporter, and then a long list of others in the field as well. The bill is bipartisan. Senator Cassidy has joined Senator Schatz in introducing it, and it's currently in front of the Senate Homeland Security and Government Affairs Committee. And on the House side, Representative Katie Porter has introduced a companion piece of legislation. And important progress is being made there too. So I'll talk now just a bit about kind of, any kind of challenges and opportunities here, and to connect it a little bit to what we've heard from others on the panel. So, the thing about these natural hazards is that it creates a kind of focusing moment very briefly, and usually in a kind of hyper-focused way, right? To the New York City example that I brought up earlier with the flash flooding, kind of an immediate discussion came into, the folks living in basement apartments, right? And should that be the case, and et cetera. And it's difficult to kind of zoom out to a national level and zoom out to a trend analysis level in each of these focusing moments. So it's difficult to kind of pull the attention of Congress back and say, okay, this is going to continue to be a problem. We're spending lots of money on this, and how do we make sure we have the right information we need to make some investments? So that is an ongoing challenge in discussing this and in proposing an idea like this. The other thing, and this might be just a little bit more obvious, oversight is tough, and getting folks to agree that this wouldn't just be another pair of eyes over their shoulder is a difficult thing. Emergency managers, especially at the state and local level, have incredibly difficult jobs. They make very difficult decisions. They're often under-resourced, and it's difficult to explain and it's difficult to talk about it, a kind of review situation that doesn't sound like a political witch hunt into them. Obviously that's not the intent of this legislation, and that's we've taken a lot of pains to make sure that it's a collaborative body that looks at root causes and a kind of system analysis and doesn't look into kind of individual decisions here, because oftentimes folks are just made in put in a very difficult situation to make these decisions. So that's all to say that it is these types of things are difficult to talk about and difficult for folks to get on board with, and the conversation's got to kind of zoom out and look at the national level and look at a kind of no fault how do we work together to do better here? And I'll wrap up there. Unfortunately, I do have a hard stop in a couple minutes, but Tim asked one more question, which is, what is the funding mechanism? Is it annual appropriations? Yes, it is. So it's, we might imagine some other ways to do this, working with the disaster relief fund or something like that. But right now, similar to the NTSB, it's an annual appropriation made to the independent entity.
Okay, thank you, Robert. That was fantastic. And I think we were certainly, this audience, this is the choir here. So what can we do as lay people to help support this effort? And what, if anything, could you pull out a crystal ball in terms of a path forward for that legislation?
Yeah. So, Tim asked a related question, which is, how do you see the climate debate influencing the discussion of the legislation? I think more and more, I forget which news outlet had this, but I remember the headline being something along the lines of, state leaders across the country of both parties are at least investing in, extreme weather events, even if we're not calling it climate change. And I think, there's just an increasing understanding that these events are happening, and certainly this is a focus of the senator's attention. And the intent is that having this kind of data, this kind of trend analysis and standardized review mechanism will inform how the country makes investments into resiliency, investments into mitigation, and gives state and local officials a kind of roadmap forward on how to protect their constituents, which they want to do. That's what that's why they work in the field they work in. It's a public service. It's a public service position, and so we think appealing to that kind of piece of it will be the way forward.
Okay, Robert. Any other questions, Glenn or Sally, for Robert before he has to go do the people's work?
Yes, it's Sally. I have just a comment that I'm so delighted to hear about this, and I want to thank Glenn and Charles for contacting Senator Schott's staff. And I'd like to say that I would like to explore some members of the Skyscraper Safety Campaign, and also our other organization, which is 9/11 Parents and Families of Firefighters and World Trade Center Victims. If we can just talk, offline or whatever, what we can do, how we can endorse this, perhaps a press conference in Washington to really announce this is something that people in our organizations longed for. And I think I wanted to say to Mr. Joyce that presenting it, focusing on the fact that it's modeled on an NTSB type of organization, I think people have great admiration for them. I know we all do. I can speak for Charles and Glenn, of course, and everyone in this field does. And I think that would give it a lot of credibility, and maybe some of these reluctant people, would come across. But I just wanted to say that to you, and please give my thanks, to Senator Schatz for pushing this forward. And I want to thank you personally, Mr. Joyce, for your investment in this.
Thank you, Sally. Thank you very much for the kind words, and I'm sure we can be in touch and talk offline. Thank you.
Thank you.
Well, thank you very much.
Thank you. I'm sorry, Charles.
Go ahead.
Yeah, no, I just want to thank Robert as well. For a lot of us in the emergency management field, this is an essential piece of legislation. There's so many opportunities that this board would be able to dive deep. We know that at least in the smaller world of fire protection and firefighting, there's no one doing full-scale fire investigations anymore. Federal government's not doing it. The national code groups aren't doing it. The states really aren't doing it either. So this is critically important. One last point. Dr. Fauci was on the other day, a couple days ago, calling for 9/11 style commission for the COVID situation. I think what we heard today, I would argue that what this bill will do is provide subject matter experts sort of at the helm and the board itself, plus of course all the staff that will be needed to support various aspects of it. I think this is a much better approach to looking at what happened with COVID, be it PPE shortages, food supply disruptions, all those kind of things. I think, Sally, do you want to, again, poor Robert's got to leave here in about 3 minutes. Sally, you just want to say something about your take on the 9/11 Commission and sort of maybe its shortcomings, perhaps, and what, we had high hopes for it, but
Yeah.
it was to some extent a politically developed report, right? So go ahead, Sal.
Absolutely, it was enormously political, and without the constant input of actually members of the Skyscraper Safety Campaign with Glenn and Charles, we attended these meetings where they were discussing, what they were going to do as far as the NIST investigation and so on and so forth. And I think there was a lot of political pressure put on people who really wanted to do a scientific investigation. But I really would suggest, and I like to see that half of this proposed, panel for this new bill, would be experts. But once you have elected officials on a committee exclusively, you know what, it's a very bad idea. And we experienced it in the last meeting of the 9/11 Commission. This is an example, but all of these things are interconnected. But at the last meeting, I attended that meeting with our wonderful attorney, Norman Siegel. And I just want to say that Norman Siegel, a civil rights and civil liberties attorney, was a key factor also in the success of a lot of these endeavors, and gave me the ability to have free speech. But at that particular meeting, I knew that the public and the families of the victims had zero input to this meeting, and we had to listen to them self-aggrandizing and praising all of these people in New York City, like the mayor, the former mayor Giuliani, and so on. I knew that we would have no input, so I made signs, truth, fiction, and lies. And
Sally, we're gonna get to that. I don't want to cut you off, but I don't know if Robert's still with us, but
I'd just like to thank him very, very much and offer our complete support to this endeavor. It's very important. Thank you.
Okay, and I think he did.
Okay, that's fine.
Yeah. So that was great. That's exciting. We'll certainly follow up with Robert and Senator Schott's office. I apologize for my previous mispronunciation, and we will keep you appraised of where this legislation is moving, but we're very happy to have had him on. So what our plan is now for the last 27 minutes is to pivot back to, we could talk about the 9/11 Commission in New York, and then just kind of identify, come back to questions of how did this get done? What needs to be done going forward? And where do we see the role of the federal government in providing oversight? So with that, why don't you go on, Sally, and continue with your discussion of why don't you start from the beginning of the 9/11 Commission slice of the story?
So the 9/11 Commission was overly politically influenced, and I attended the last meeting of it in New York City in the New School, and Thank God that I had the foresight to bring Norman Siegel, our wonderful civil liberties attorney, with us. And I want to say regarding the input and the role of Norman Siegel, we never would have had the voice that we did without Norman Siegel, and we would not have been able to demonstrate and so on and so forth. And someone asked Norman when he first became involved, with our group, which of course myself and Monica Gabriel, who was my my co-chair and my partner throughout all of this, we went down to see him and begged him to represent us, and he did pro bono for 20 years now. But so I brought these signs, and all of these political people were, complimenting this one and that one and so on, and really talking about Rudy Giuliani, the idea of the radios, everything that happened, all the shortcomings of the Giuliani administration in those days, and the needless deaths of 343 firefighters, the most wonderful group of people that you could even dream of. That was something that did not allow me to listen to people praising how great everything worked out in New York City on 9/11, because it did not. And the 343 firefighters plus the police officers and the EMTs died a needless and brutal death that could have been and should have been avoided. Anyway, I knew I would not have input, so I brought my signs, and I would hold up these signs with my civil liberties attorney, Norman Siegel, next to me. And it was lies, truth, and fiction, and they didn't like it. They sent over a guard to throw me out. Everyone knew that I was a mother of a fallen firefighter and so on and so forth, and yet they were willing to throw me out. And God bless Norman Siegel. And by the way, some people in the beginning of his advocacy for us asked him, Norman, what are you doing hanging around with firefighter families? And he said, the first and foremost civil right is the right to life. And their right to life was violated on 9/11. And that's why he's supporting the families of firefighters. Anyway, when the guard came over to try to throw me out, Norman spoke to them privately and reminded them that outside of the new school was an army of media. And if I would be thrown out of that, that would be the greatest thing that ever happened for the families of the victims who had no voice. So it was very political. And also the fact that in the 9/11 Commission, with their findings and so on and so forth, whatever, they didn't even want to include anything about the radio failures, the Motorola radio failures. And again, Glenn went down previous to this meeting down to Washington, and we attended any kind of hearings we could and so on and so forth about their preliminary findings. And I insisted, when I heard that they weren't even going to mention that, I insisted that that had to be included, because the failures of communication, as we all know, emergency management has a lot of factors, and you have to have excellent communication, and we didn't do that. So it was a very interesting experience for me. If I didn't have Norman Siegel next to me, no one would have ever been able to make any comments or express their opinion about what was going on at that last hearing. So it was very hard for the families. We had to fight against the system that basically wanted to subdue a lot of these bitter facts about the failures of the system on 9/11. And my goal, I could not save my son on 9/11, but we created the Regenhard Center, which I'm so appreciative to John Jay for, and Glenn and Charles. I couldn't save my son, but I didn't want any other mother's son, any other firefighter, or police officer, EMT, or other first responder to ever die because the radios didn't work. And hopefully, you know, we brought that out there. But it has been a battle really for truth the whole way. And there's a lot of people who are responsible for it. I'm just the poster mother of this this whole crusade, if I'm allowed to say that word. But it was the input of Charles and Glenn and all of these wonderful experts who really helped to show the truth about it and to make a commitment to improve this and never have this needless slaughter of our heroes ever happen again.
Thank you, Sally, for that. And I think just because some people may have forgotten, if you look back at the historical record, there were really, the 9/11 Commission was very controversial initially, and the Bush administration was dead set against it. And it was only through a great deal of pressure. And even after the commission was formed, there's a fairly long record of contention where there were disagreements over access to classified material, access to White House staff, and so on. And so, although we now look back at, the 9/11 Commission as kind of a, naturally we had a commission to look at this event, that was not a fait accompli. And a lot of people fought throughout government broadly to see that done. And once the commission was done, and that's that was a big story unto itself. The other thing, Sally, which you didn't share, I think in my whole recollection of the kind of post 9/11 venues and things that were going on, there were two moments, one of which was one was you, of course, at the 9/11 Commission when they were in New York, and when the city was taking the position that the radio system didn't fail on 9/11, you shouted out, and that was a televised live event, and so and you did it loud enough that the whole country and the whole world really heard that. And had you not done it, and it really was a remarkable act of, it had been orchestrated as a victory lap for the city of New York, and a kind of, and this is not to diminish the good that was done on that day, but my God, how do you sit there and just sit there and like nothing went wrong and there was no room for improvement, and we did a hell of a job.
I have to say, Charles, that was totally spontaneous. I didn't plan that. I didn't, expect to do that. But when I heard these people, exactly the way you described it, that was what was happening. And they were talking about how great Rudy Giuliani was and so on. I just jumped up and I just yelled out and screamed out that Rudy Giuliani shares responsibility for the lack of communication and the needless deaths of 343 firefighters. It was just, and then other people started shouting also. And I'll never forget that the chairperson of the commission, is saying, stop this, you're wasting time, to me. And God bless, there was a young man in the back. I never knew him. Just by the grace of God, his name was Christian, I learned later. So that was very bizarre. And he jumped up and said, no, you're wasting time. And, everything broke out, and it should have. Otherwise, it was just like everyone covering everything up, and the families of the victims sitting there with gags over their mouths like we all did. And that was meaningful. And, I actually forgot because so many things that happened, but I do want to say one last word about this 9/11 Commission report. In the beginning of the book, there's a statement from the chairman of the commission saying that 9/11 was a, quote, failure of imagination. What a ripoff. I'm going to say, and everyone knows this, 9/11 wasn't a failure of imagination. 9/11 was a failure of people on every level of government, from Washington, D.C., to the state of New York, to the Port Authority, to the city of New York, meaning the Giuliani administration. It was a failure of every level of government to do their jobs. It was not about a failure of imagination. That is the biggest ripoff phrase I think that anyone ever invented. But that's what 9/11 was, and it was a catastrophe. People refer to these things as a tragedy. A tragedy is something that's inevitable, that something is going to happen. It's Romeo and Juliet, and you commit suicide by mistake, and you really, whatever. Okay, that's what a tragedy is. 9/11 was a catastrophe, a failure of all the systems that were meant to protect this country from the FAA, from Washington, from the Homeland Security people, just to everyone. Everyone failed, and that's what it was all about. So thanks, Charles, for reminding me of what I did.
Okay. And the other moment was also captured on video by our good friend Jake Pauls, who's on the advisory board for the Skyscraper Safety Campaign, was Beverly Eckert.
Yes.
When they were
Yes.
having the NIST had a hearing in Manhattan. I still remember it was at the Marriott on Lexington Avenue in the 40s. And that was a room full of engineers and architects and lobbyists for various and sundry interests. But boy, when she told the story of being on the telephone with her husband and not knowing what was happening and the building collapsing while she was on the phone with him, I mean, right now I could channel that. I mean, that was a moment, the electricity, the sheer power of that statement. I don't think anybody in that room will ever forget it. And she was able to harness that and very much talked about the importance of communication and situation awareness, not to get all technical now, but a term in terms of command and control. And of course, the horrible irony of the situation awareness implications in the airplane crash that ended up taking her life. And so I just wanted to acknowledge that.
Yes.
And
you know, Charles, I want to
advocate
thank
she
you
was.
for, I'd like to thank you for pointing that out. You know, it was my omission not to speak about that. And Beverly Eckert, she should rest in peace, was a fabulous person. She was such an asset. You know, my co-chair, Monica Gabriel, worked alongside of me, and we networked all the time. We did everything together. No one can do anything on their own. And the people that supported this effort and so on, I appreciate all of them. There's so many 9/11 family members who don't get the focus, but I must say it takes a lot of people to achieve something, and I appreciate all of them. And thank you for mentioning Beverly.
Okay. All right. Well, we've got in the time remaining, we are certainly open for any questions from the audience. And so please send those in via chat. And I think it's probably safe at this point, given we're only looking at about 10 minutes or so. We'll go around the panel one last time for any closing remarks. And I'll go ahead and let you start us off, Tim.
Oh, thanks, Charles. I'd just like to add one other thing too, in terms of the reference to the firefighters. At the time, you know, Sherry Bullard was one of the leading voices for the first responder community. He was the founder of the Congressional Fire Services Caucus. It just happened to be that way. A total coincidence in the sense that he was the chairman overseeing NIST at that time. And so there was a strong resonance for him with the firefighters. So, you know, with any of these things in terms of a policymaking or legislation, there's often a strong personal attachment, either by the members or the people engaged in that debate. And that's usually how things often move forward. Yes, we talk about statistics and structural things and systemic issues, but oftentimes it comes down to the personal. That's not always achievable or, replicable sometimes, but it's always something to be aware of. And certainly, as we've seen from Sally's advocacy, very powerful, that powerful voice in those images. So I'd just like to conclude one more thing on Sherry Bullard. One of the things that in his retirement, Sherry never really spent much time thinking about his legacy, which was tremendous across so many domains, as I said at the outset. So one of the many projects that I've taken on is to try to rectify a little bit of that. And so I've begun to have some discussions with people about doing a session or symposium in not just in his honor, but in many ways similar to what you're doing here, and how can the issues that he championed inform the debates of today and then also of the future. So one of the things I'd ask of the group is, if folks are interested, to please email me and I'll keep them informed as we do this. I've been working with faculty at Syracuse University, but I would love to include particularly this discussion as an example of what we're trying to engender. So thanks so much for having me.
Okay, thank you, Tim. That was great. Glenn?
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Charles, and thank you, Tim, for all that hard work years ago. Excuse me. Like I said, I think that, the NCST is a stepping stone to the Disaster Investigation Board that Robert is working on. We did learn a lot along the way about how things work. We learned, again, what we just talked about with the 9/11 Commission. I think the NTSB model is really essential to this. In my estimation, we're desperate for independent, sort of transparent entity within the federal government to do this kind of work, because as we all know, as time moves on, people forget about things. And, at some point, hopefully we'll get back to something we can call normal in terms of our post-COVID era here. But there are so many lessons that we need to learn about all the issues that came up in the last 2 years. And I really hope that this bill goes forward, because, again, I think it's essential for the public to have something like this, because, the fact that Tim was working on that bill with Chairman Bullard, it was to some extent like, why don't we have something like this to begin with? I mean, it's just like we're relying on state and local government and private entities to do this work, and we really can't. I mean, these issues about, back in 9/11, the issues of high-rise safety and things, they apply across the entire country. They don't apply just to New York. And the same thing with what we've been dealing with COVID and so many other kinds of issues that come up with wildland fires, as Robert mentioned earlier, and other kinds of natural disasters, but also man-made as well. And where can we be better? What can we learn from these things? Because at the end of the day, the legislation that Tim helped develop, the most important part, I think, at least to me, and I think to Sally and Charles as well, I won't speak for them on this point, but the most important part of it is like, not to what we just learned, but what are the recommendations? What can we do to positively influence things so we don't repeat what happened? We don't have the same kind of problems. Where do we need to do additional research? Those kind of things. So I'm really hopeful about this. And like I said, Chairman Bullard set the standard here. So even though unfortunately he's not with us right now, he did set the bar. And I think Tim's work about recognizing his efforts and how they apply to current situations, be it global warming or whatever, he's the gold standard to do this, and he can have a legacy in that manner. So thank you to Tim, and thank you to Robert, and of course Charles and Sally. I think this was a great session for all the attendees, which, by the way, will be people that will be watching this video a year or two from now thinking, gee, these guys are really, and gals are on top of things. So anyway, thank you.
Thank you, Glenn.
Tim, did you have anything else you wanted to say?
Yeah, I guess, for future conversation, obviously we're out of time, but I think that, the biggest impediment that I see to the future legislation is the politics of FEMA itself. That's always been the biggest impediment to some of these things, particularly as we broaden out the vision for this new legislation. The Construction Safety Teams Act was successful in part because, to be quite blunt, we kept FEMA out of it and was able to go forward without having to go through the jurisdiction of other committees. That was one thing, but also, again, the politics of FEMA itself, which then has to engage with, for example, the Port Authority and the other entities that are closely tied to FEMA. So that's going to be a challenge, I think, politically for the new legislation, but it's obviously critically needed and hopefully we'll be able to advance.
Well, Tim, if you're giving advice to the lay people out there, what is this, letter writing? Is this professional groups advocating? Is it all the above? What can people on the sidelines do to help? Yeah,
that's a great question, Charles. I think that, again, we talk a lot about the data, and that's obviously one component, but I think a lot of people do tend to get wrapped around that axle of, but at the end of the day, these are real lives of actual people who are, impacted by these things, and nothing can substitute for that. Nothing can substitute for the visual of someone losing their lives. Unfortunately, that's often the case when you have discussions over issues of security and things like that, but we are all a prisoner of our cognitive biases called availability. And that gets played out in the policymaking realm. So if you look at what the things that Sally did and continues to do, that is very powerful. And combined with the data and understanding that you all bring to the table is really how something like this is going to get over the line. That's my feeling. And so yes, and then you touched briefly on the tactics. We could go on and on and on and on about that probably at another time, but the tactics need to show some degree of broad-based support. So in other words, it wasn't just Sally. She said she was the spokesperson. She was the public face, but there were 300 plus firefighters who lost their lives, and then also the thousands of other people who lost their lives. And that has a broad impact. And so when you can show that of how this would be, and show that in a very concrete and visceral fashion, that has a great power in the policy making realm.
All right, Tim. Well, look, we're going to have to be in touch here. You got a lot of great information, so we haven't heard the last of us on this thing. But I just, in the last couple of minutes, I just want to thank everybody. And it's always nice to get recognized by Sally. But I want to just reiterate 2 points. One is that this wasn't easy. And what Sally said is it wasn't, just the three of us going on and locking arms and, buy a ticket to on Amtrak and everything happened. There was so much work that went into it by a lot of people, a lot of groups behind it. And I think I know I speak for Glenn when I say, to Sally, that it's really been a privilege. And, in terms of a professor and an academic life, you make a difference, but it's very seldom direct, and it's usually diffuse. It's years later, when somebody may come back to you and thank you for something. But to have the privilege, honestly, of helping out on a cause that was so important to us as New Yorkers, as professionals, as people, was something it's irreplaceable. And as Glenn said, we would get nowhere. I assure you, absolutely nowhere. No doors open in Washington for a professor with a good idea. So on that note, I want to thank everybody for participating today. I want to thank Sally for allowing herself to actually tell the story, because she can tell it unlike anybody else.
I think she's got her hand up.
I think she's got her hand up.
Oh, she's got her hand up.
Final comment. Okay.
Okay. Okay. Go ahead, Sally.
I just wanted to say a word to Mr. Tim Clancy. I want to thank you so much for the work that you've done in the past and for the work that you're continuing to do. And the project that you're working on, it would be my honor to be included to speak about how important the Sherry Boehlert was to us, to all the families. And one last thing, you mentioned that you weren't aware of the visitation that Monica and I made with John McCain. I have to say that you're so on target about the personal connection. That is what accomplishes things. And when I decided to, Glenn mentioned that Congress held, a type of session in New York that day. Well, after that is when John McCain went out to Staten Island to meet with a VFW group, a veterans group. And I said to Monica, we're going to Staten Island. And she goes, Staten Island, why? We went there. We just went into that reception hall where they had it. We joined them. We sat down at the table. Of course, we had all our 9/11 memorabilia and so on and so forth. But we were talking, and the veterans, God bless them, were, asking questions of John McCain. And then, I got up and I presented him with a T-shirt. The wonderful firefighters who, survived, and in honor of their fallen brothers, they made up a lot of these T-shirts, honoring the fallen. And I had my son's T-shirt, and there was an artwork in the back of it. And I said, Senator McCain, I want to give you this T-shirt in memory of my son. And then I told him, what we were trying to accomplish, and so on and so forth. And I wouldn't have known, Tim, that like the next day, like things changed. I really feel it was that personal interaction. And if the families of the victims can have any role in any, establishing and continuing any of these safety initiatives in memory of Congressman Boehlert, then I'd be happy to involve us in it. Thank you. Thank you, Tim Clancy, for all of your work and for your humanity and your intelligence.
Thanks, Sally. We really appreciate that so much. Look forward to talking to you again.
Thank you.
Okay, on that note, I don't think we can do any better. So thanks once again for the attendees, and thank you very much for the panelists. And we will have this posted online, and we'll send an email out when it is. So thank you very much. Have a good day.